Hello, Green Spring. Today is Monday, and it's April 18th, 2016. I'm Fran Duval, your host for today, and I'm here again with our quarterly show on presidents and presidential libraries. And today we're going to talk about Harry S. Truman with Len Cockworth, our resident expert in this area. Hi, Len.
Thank you. Thank you for the compliment. Yes, we're going to deal with Harry Truman, and probably, as far as I'm concerned, no other president was involved in so many events that I don't think that we can do justice to his presidency in the half-hour time, but we'll try. And we're going to use a different approach this morning. We're going to go to his library and see some of the highlights as is pointed out in his library, and we'll talk about that. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the historical site in Independence, Missouri. And this is an area in Independence, Missouri that is quite large and is set aside as being his historic site. His home is located here. Also, as you walk around, you'll see a number of things that he was involved in. For example, the Clinton drugstore. This is where he started working when he was, I think, 14 years of age. He would go down at 6:30 in the morning. He would open the store and get it ready for the proprietor. And I forget what his income was, but it was very, 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 very small. Then as you walk down the street, you'll see all kinds of banners regarding Truman. In fact, every light stander has this particular silhouette of him walking with his hat on and his cane, and he was noted for being a walker. He walked every day. Then the next thing I'd like to show is his house, which is also in that same area. It's a 14-room Victorian house owned by the Park Commission. When we were there, this is before the daughter Margaret had died.
And so we is your wife Bev and
yes.
You. Yeah, okay.
Not you.
Not me.
Yes, when we were there, we could not go upstairs because Margaret's clothes were still there, and there was always a possibility that she would be coming home. It was, after all, her childhood home. She has since is deceased, and now the upstairs is also available for people to go in. Then we went a short distance, not very far, to his presidential library, and this is where we're going to spend some time. It's located right along a highway. It's like on a small hill. Beautiful setting, by the way. And the next picture is not a tour guide, but it happens to be Beth. And then we'll go inside of this library. The exterior of the library we'll see next. A beautiful place, very large. When you get inside, you are reminded of the things that he was involved in. He was, of course, an accidental president because he became president when he was vice president, and then FDR died. He had only been vice president for, I think, something like 80-some days, and suddenly he became president.
He almost had a full term.
Yes, almost a full term.
Wasn't elected
because of
as
that.
president.
Right,
then,
yes. And he said the day that he was told that FDR had died, he said that he felt like a load of hay had fallen on him. And he said, "Do you ever have any idea what it would be like for the sun and the moon and the stars to fall on you?" And he said, "That's the way I felt that day." He was, in one way, totally unprepared to be the president. FDR had not told him really anything that was happening. He didn't even know about the Manhattan Project, which was the development of the atomic bomb. However, because he was not, he had not been elected, he had not run, he made promises to no one. He was completely free, and he felt completely free to tell off the generals and admirals if necessary, as well as seasoned politicians, because he was his own man. And However, even at that, he also realized that he was totally responsible, and the buck always stopped with him. In the library, there is, first of all, like most of the presidential libraries, a replica of the Oval Office. And apparently this is what the Oval Office looked like when he was president. In addition to that, and by the way, we'll move on to the next picture here. This is very early in the library, shows you the buck stops here, and that was a famous statement of his. All right, now as we walk through the library, I took pictures of the different displays. Many of those are newspaper clippings, but it tells us the tremendous events in which he was involved. And for example, the United Nations Charter was signed at that time when he was president. And as it says there, that he predicted early ratification. There were supposed to be 51 countries that were signing it. 50 countries did sign it. This took place in San Francisco. The only country that did not sign it at the time was Poland. However, Poland signed it, I think, about 2 months later. So there were 51 charter members of the United Nations. Now,
And just as a woman, speaking of that United Nations,
yes.
he appointed or included as one of the delegates Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, he did.
To that.
Yes, he did.
You know. But anyway,
yes.
just an aside.
Very important. Well, he was a man who was quite different in many ways, and he was in many ways very progressive, and he had to deal with some serious issues. The next one, the issue that he had to deal with, was really the one that I think most people remember, if they remember anything at all about Harry Truman at all, and that was the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And it was a serious decision on his part, and many people were absolutely aghast that he did that, and still others very much in favor of it. His feeling was that many lives would be saved if this took place. And many a serviceman, in fact, any number of servicemen here have indicated that because the bomb was dropped, they feel that they are still alive today. So, yeah. But it was a very, very controversial thing on his part. His point was, among other things, the reason he did it is because he felt that it was no different than the firebombing that had taken place in Dresden, Germany toward the end of the war, which you will recall was right toward the end of the war, or any different than the firebombing of Tokyo. And thousands of people died as a result of that as well. He also felt that if there was going to be an invasion of Japan, a Normandy-like invasion, many Japanese would have also lost their lives, so that this was the basis. It's still controversial, I know that, and we're not arguing pro or con, but
Right.
he was really in the midst of that major decision. Then the dropping of the atomic bomb, I think that we have something there, a headline there. And then also, the next thing is that at this particular point, the 2 bombs were dropped, of course. The first one was dropped, and then I think it was 9 days later, the second bomb was dropped. And during that time, Russia entered the Pacific War. And there are those who felt that Russia went in because they saw that now the war was coming to an end. But my reading indicates that this had already been decided at the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt was there, and Russia was going to enter into the Pacific War at that time. And of course, the next one I think has to do with the Soviets also exploding the atomic bomb. And then the next one has to do with the hydrogen bomb. I guess I'm out of order here, but still. The war ends. Many of us remember that particular day, how exciting everybody was.
I was just a kid, but I mean, I had brothers and cousins and
Yeah.
people in the service, and it was a big celebration in my family.
Oh,
You
yes.
know,
I remember it very well. It was a wonderful, wonderful day. So, okay, we'll move on. The next one is a statement by Harry Truman that all Americans, whatever their job or whatever their income, wherever they live or whatever their race or creed, are entitled to a good education, good medical care, and a decent place to live. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he did, he had an executive order in which he desegregated the armed forces.
Right.
And again, he was very much in favor of all people, even though he was a Southerner. And in spite of that, he signed. Of course, it created political problems for him because of the Southern Democrats. They were
Right.
very much opposed to what he was doing here. Okay. Now, when Truman became president, this was an entirely different social era in many ways, because America now was moving from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. And because of that, there were any number of problems that was created. I'd like to show you a little bit about what America looked like at that time. Mm-hmm. Remember the chrome tabletop?
Chrome table. We had one.
Yeah, so we did too. And then the television. And then on the left side of the screen there, you'll see the picture of the commuters. This almost looked like the Long Island Railroad, for example, as people were
standing at a
and then on the right side, you'll notice this was a mass production of homes. And I remember this. This was a building for this may very well be Levittown, Long Island, because that was one of the mass-produced houses, and how quickly they went up. And at the time in Levittown, Long Island, for example, only veterans could buy a house, and the cost was, as I recall, $4,800.
Wow!
But that included a washing machine, and that was again something quite different than what other homes had, for example. Yeah. All right. We have the modern kitchen, and we have a modern refrigerator. The refrigerator that day, maybe it doesn't look too old, but in many ways, but that was again something that people were getting
thrilled
for the first
to have.
time. Yes.
And that little freezer unit in the center there.
Yeah.
Put ice cubes.
Yeah. But all was not well at that time. Even though people were buying these and so on, there was a social unrest at that time. For example, veterans wanted more money than they were getting. It was also a time when women now were actually in the workforce. They had entered the workforce during World War II and continued, and were now competing. Now, the women here are dressed in, I guess, dresses, but in many ways, that was also the beginning where women were beginning to wear
trousers or whatever,
pantsuits and so on.
Right.
So again, things were changing so rapidly at that time. Now, there was that unrest. There were a number of strikes at that time that Truman had to deal with. I remember Montgomery Ward had a strike, for example, some of the others. And then the next thing that he had to deal with was the reconstruction of Europe. Now, Europe was in terrible shape at that time. Of course, most of the factories had been destroyed. People were starving, and Truman felt, we had to do something to rebuild Europe, and this was done through a plan that he and George Marshall developed. Marshall made his famous statement over at Harvard University, where he talked about how the rebuilding of Europe was necessary. And of course, there was some vested self-interest in this also, because if Europe could be rebuilt, we would have a trading partner as well. And it was good for politically
Right,
also.
right.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right. Then the other big issue here is communism. And it's hard to recreate the kind of feeling that took place at that time, but there was almost a hysteria. People were so afraid of communism and the spread of communism and the need to stop the communism. And so the architects of containment here, and that policy was any particular place in the world where communism seemed to be making inroads, the United States would be there to try to stop it. Yes. These are the men who were involved in that. And then right out of that grew the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine said that we would provide military and economic and political help to any country, any democratic country, where there was a threat from external authoritarianism. So, all right.
And by the way, in my reading of both those plans, there was bipartisan support of those in Congress.
There was. That's right.
Yeah. Now
Then we had,
Berlin.
again, this was the result of the division of Germany after World War II. There were four powers, the United States, Russia, France, and Great Britain. Each had a section of Germany that they controlled. And the American section was located in the heart of the Russian section. And then Russia created a blockade where you could not get to the American section in any way, with the hope of kind of starving the people and getting them to submit to communism. And it probably would have worked, except that Truman and his people developed the Berlin airlift, where planes continued to fly, not just every day, but every hour, almost every minute in which they brought cargo. And I think it was almost a year that this took place. They brought food and so on. So, and finally, after about a year, Russia relented, and the Americans were able to go into their section. Then there were a real change here in the 10 fateful months. The first thing that was China became communistic. And there were really two governments for China at that time. The majority was communism, but the nationalist government moved to Taiwan. And until 1970, that was recognized as being the government. But again, this is something that Truman had to deal with, the communist influence. We have to move along a little bit here, because now we have another major issue. Alger Hiss, he worked for the government. He was accused of being a communist spy, although he was never found guilty of that. But Whittaker Chambers testified against him. Whittaker Chambers had been a communist, but they could never prove that Hiss had been a spy. But they found him guilty of perjury. So, but again, this was all during Truman's time, and this was part of the hysteria of the day. Then the next one, this one is probably a little bit better known, but Joseph McCarthy. He was one who said that there were so many communists working in the government. In fact, I remember hearing one of his speeches in which he said that there were 57 communists in the State Department. And somebody said that he got that number off the ketchup bottle, Heinz ketchup. But he had no proof of any of this, you see.
Yeah.
And so the word McCarthyism has come into our language, meaning when a person makes unsubstantial, charges against somebody and charges that can't be proven. It was a terrible time at that time. That's when the House Un-American Activities Committee was involved, trying to get, and especially people in the movie industry, saying that there were so many communists there and so on. So, and if there were, what do you call it, blackballed?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That they still are making films. Hollywood is still making films about that era.
Yeah, I can see why.
Yeah.
They were very much involved. Okay. After McCarthy, we're talking about, he approved the hydrogen bomb. Now, the hydrogen bomb was much more devastating than the atomic bomb. And of course, it was never used, but it was exploded in the Pacific. And they were amazed at the amount of destruction that took place, even a long distance away. They had evacuated all the islands except some distance away, and these people still got radiation. And there were some fishermen, I don't know how many miles away, and they also experienced radiation, and one of them, at least one of them, died as a result of it. So that was the result of their test in the Pacific. Then he had to deal with even a more difficult problem, and that was Korea. And of course, they were at the 38th parallel. They fought. And then MacArthur was involved in this. MacArthur made a fantastic landing in Incheon, but the war continued to drag on, and there were many who were accusing Truman of losing the war. And by the way, his popularity was not very high because of all of these things, and because even the Democrats were divided. So his popularity went down. And then he had to deal with General MacArthur for insubordination, because MacArthur wanted to move the war into China, wanted to drop a bomb on China. And well, it's a long story, but Truman met with MacArthur on Wake Island, and MacArthur apparently seemed to acquiesce, and yet he didn't. And after that, he fired him for insubordination, which meant that Truman was willing to stand up to a politician and to a military person. And that became very controversial because MacArthur had been very, very popular during World War II.
And he was still popular after that.
Oh, he was. And then he made his famous speech to the joint session of Congress, old soldiers will never die. So, all right. Then he had another one he had to deal with, and that was, we'll go on to that of the country of Israel. It was in June 14th, I think it was.
May 14th.
May 14th, I'm sorry. That Israel
1948.
1948, and Israel declared themselves as a state.
Right.
And I think it was like 11 minutes after midnight, Harry Truman accepted that. And again, this was very controversial. But, well, for one thing, Harry Truman had a Jewish business partner, and they went bankrupt, by the way. And by the way, I have to throw this in. Even though they went bankrupt, Harry Truman paid back all of the creditors. Now, he had this Jewish businessman. That might have influenced him somewhat. The other was that he was up for election, and he needed the Jewish vote in New York City, so that may have been another factor. But in any event, it was Truman who recognized Israel as a country.
Well, he was compassionate about the way the Jews had been treated during the war.
Yes, that too. Yes.
And was fighting his advisors who said, don't do that because the oil is so important.
Not only that, his own Secretary of State, General Marshall, said, if you recognize Israel and if I have to vote, I will not vote for you. And that was his own Secretary of State. So you can see how divided the administration was. his popularity was dropping even more. I know that when he left the White House, his popularity was lower than that of George W. Bush. But here he's going to run for re-election. The Republicans put Dewey against him, and there was no question about the fact that Dewey was going to win.
That's right.
However, Truman then did his whistle-stop tour, in which he traveled across the United States, and he stopped at all of these little towns across the way, in which he would be speaking to people.
Directly to the people.
Directly to the people.
Correct.
And they said that he spoke without any notes. He spoke very personally and so on. And the polls indicated that Dewey was going to win without any question. Several reasons they say that the polls were so far off. One of them was that the press paid no attention to what was happening out in the Midwest and Far West. The other is that the polling at that time was done by telephone, and many of the people living out in the Midwest and Far West did not have a telephone.
Didn't even have telephones.
They didn't have it, so that it was really skewed. The results were.
So does that let the Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, off the hook that they were following the polls and they declared Dewey?
Yeah, well, and Truman loved that. He used that and by the way, that newspaper headline appears in the museum as well. He held that up many, many times. Dewey won, by the way. Excuse me, Dewey did not win, even though the Chicago Tribune said he did. Truman won 303 electoral votes. Dewey got 189.
And there were a few to Wallace.
Wallace and what's the other guy's name?
I don't know.
The very right-wing person from the South. He got 39 votes, and Henry Wallace got 0. Now, it's interesting. Henry Wallace was the vice president of FDR in the previous term. Now, if Roosevelt had died 80-some days sooner, Henry Wallace would have been president instead of Harry Truman. But he was very much on the left, and then this other man was very much of a right-winger. Truman was aware.
We have about 1 minute.
Truman was aware of his low popularity. I'm not able to read this. I hope the people watching it on television are able to read it, but it's too small for me from this
distance.
this distance. We'll move on then to go into his library. This is a great statement that he made here, and Truman was very much of a family man. And he always felt that his family was most important. And of course, when Margaret did her concert in D.C., and he wrote that scathing letter to the music critic, excuse me, it just showed how he was protecting his own.
Devoted, he was.
And then let's go on. This is the back of the library, and this is the grave of both Margaret and Bess Truman. And by the way, they lived in that house their whole married life, and it was never owned by him. It was always owned by Bess's mother, and then after she died, it was Bess's. But Harry never. And by the way, his mother-in-law never thought much of Harry. Even when he was president, she said that he'll never amount to anything. So that was the kind of relationship that he had there with his. Okay, and then we have one more picture. No, two more pictures here. This is one speaking about
Margaret,
his. And then the next one, I had to say goodbye to Harry.
Len, you were taller. You're taller than me.
Yes. I was surprised. But he was an interesting man. I think of all the presidents, I think he was confronted with more major decisions than anyone.
That affected our nation.
Yes. And I'm sorry that we couldn't possibly do justice to it, but I hope this is enticing people to think and read about Harry Truman, who I think was.
There have been some wonderful books written about him. David McCulloch's is
Absolutely.
one of the most readable and famous.
A very big one.
And then, yeah, well, you know, it's
Yeah,
a heavy
it's
book.
thorough, yeah.
Get it on your Nook or your iPad or something.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've written your book about the library.
Yes.
And so that's something that you're always willing to talk to people about
Yes,
and
and
sell them and
the book
whatever.
is right here. It's going to be in the authors section of the library.
Yeah.
And I have it available at any time people want it. so.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It was good to relive some of that, having been a young girl then, but I still, being from the family of Democrats, you know, the presidential business was very much a dinner table conversation with us.
Sure.